An ancient evil stirs in the black lands of Mordor, and the people of Middle-earth speak of a terrible doom approaching from the east. The Dark Lord Sauron is gathering his forces, and should he acquire the power he seeks, he will cast the world into eternal shadow. The only hope lies in a heroic few who must work together to stem the tide of evil.
When I first decided I wanted to make a retrospective video on the Lord of the Rings the card game, I initially envisioned the video as a leisurely walk through the history of the game. But I realized as we approach Top 100 Board Games of All Time season for the board game YouTuber community that I have something a little bit more interesting to offer all of you. The Lord of the Rings the card game is the greatest modern card game. That's right. The fact that the Lord of the Rings the card game is the greatest modern card game comes down to three factors. One, the way it executes on cooperative play. Two, the way the game integrates with the theme of the Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth at large. And three, with the card pool itself when it comes to your deck construction option. We're going to talk about all three of these arguments in this video series. Yeah, that's right. This retrospective is going to first be released as a video series. And we will get that walk through the history of the game when we talk about the card pool. What better time to be talking about the prowess of the Lord of the Rings the card game than now? I'm recording this in December of 2024. Like the theatrical version of Return of the King, the Lord of the Rings the card game has more than one ending because we are at the end of the cycle of repackaged expansions for the game. We're at the precipice of ending number 2, which in the movie would be the throwing of the ring into Mount Doom. But before we diminish and go into the West, let's take one more journey on some direction along the Anduin and start with the setting of the Lord of the Rings the card game, Middle-earth.
I was there, Gandalf. I was there 3,000 years ago.
The origins of the Lord of the Rings the card game trace back to the early 2010s, when Fantasy Flight Games was already known for its rich thematic games. The designer, Nate French, sought to create a game that was not only faithful to the source material, but also something that could be played solo or cooperatively, which is a significant departure from the competitive nature of most card games at the time. Now, the Lord of the Rings the card game was not the first Lord of the Rings card game, much less the first Lord of the Rings tabletop game. Far from it. There are many Lord of the Rings themed tabletop games of note. When it comes to card games, you had the Middle-earth collectible card game, which ran from 1995 to 1998. Now, this game was released around the same time you saw Magic the Gathering and the Pokemon trading card game dominating the tabletop scene, well before the golden age of board gaming, for which most of the Lord of the Rings card game's life has taken place in. The Middle-earth collectible card game also can take credit for kickstarting the Lure of Middle-earth convention over in Germany. That card game only lasted 3 years and was not nearly as popular as other games that were released after the Peter Jackson movie trilogy from 2001 to 2003. Another Lord of the Rings card game was the Lord of the Rings trading card game. This game was active from 2001 to 2007. This game is notable to me because when I first received the game as a gift from my wife, she also threw in a booster pack for this game. So there wasn't much I could do with it, but she thought it was part of the game, which is totally understandable. There weren't a lot of choices back then. When it comes to board games, October of 2000 saw Reiner Knizia's The Lord of the Rings. Came out a year before the Lord of the Rings trilogy hit theaters, and to be honest, at the time, it didn't seem as poorly titled as it is now. The fact that expansions dropped the is a bit of a blemish on the game's history. Speaking of dropping the, Cosmos produced Lord of the Rings The Duel in 2002. 2 versions of Lord of the Rings Risk were released concurrently with the movie trilogy. You had the Lord of the Rings Risk and Lord of the Rings Risk Trilogy Edition, the Trilogy Edition being the better of the two. Games Workshop would release the first version of their studio-saving Middle-earth strategy battle game in 2001. In 2002, Reiner Knizia was again making Lord of the Rings games, where he made the first version of the Stratego killer, The Lord of the Rings The Confrontation. That game would end up getting a new edition a few years later, and is still today one of the best replacements for any Stratego-style two-player game. The often overlooked Middle-earth quest was released by Fantasy Flight Games in 2009. Remember, Fantasy Flight is the studio that produces the Lord of the Rings, the card game. The first and second editions of War of the Ring were released in 2004 and 2011, respectively. The latter of which, the second edition, is rated by many as one of the best board games ever made. It is one of the few risers on the Board Game Geek Top 100, and despite a handful of expansions, still operates as a great 2 or 4 player epic gaming experience. It's safe to say that Fantasy Flight Games was not breaking completely new ground by releasing a Lord of the Rings game in 2011, as it did with the Lord of the Rings, the card game. But what was groundbreaking was the design. Nate French, the initial designer of the game, put together a system that would eventually provide the mining equipment for delving more deeply and more greedily into Middle-earth than any game had ever gone before on the tabletop. Mining on the tabletop. In a recent interview with Nerd of the Rings, Lord of the Rings the card game chief designer Caleb Grace, who took over for Nate French early on in the game's life, talked about how in his office in the Fantasy Flight Studios, you'd have a map of Middle-earth, and that it was used for inspiration for where to go with various expansions to the game, and it certainly shows. You see, unlike many of the tabletop implementations of Lord of the Rings games, the Lord of the Rings the card game did not start in the setting of the movie or the titular book. Titular? Of the titular book. I've never said that word before. It sounds a little bit weird coming out. The missions of the core set take place in Mirkwood, which is an area that was somewhat explored in The Hobbit, but goes almost unmentioned in most Lord of the Rings games. And from there, it would only get better. You see, many Lord of the Rings board games have the issue of playing out the events of the book and the movie. The ones that everyone is very familiar with. Everyone knows what happens during the course of Lord of the Rings. Spoiler alert, the forces of men and the West at large hold out long enough so that Frodo and Sam and Gollum can destroy the ring. So most board games that take place in this setting have you reliving those events to some degree. Now, this could be good and bad. If you want to relive the movie, that can be fun. However, there's not going to be a lot of drama to that. Truly relive the movie, the same things are going to happen. You already know the beats of the story, unless you've never actually seen the movie before, in which case you're probably not even bothering to buy a Lord of the Rings game. So what most games do is they provide a bit of a twist. For example, in War of the Ring, one player takes over the forces of good and the Fellowship, and the other player takes on the role of Sauron, controlling the forces of Mordor, and Isengard and the forces of evil. The Fellowship player could send the Fellowship on a completely different route than the Fellowship actually transversed in the movie. And that could be a very interesting story. Or you could follow the path as it goes. And that seems like a fine enough option for some people, but for people like me, I'm frustrated sometimes having to go back and forth between, am I in the movie or am I doing something completely different? If I fail as the Fellowship player, that's just kind of sucks, because part of why I like the movie is because of what happens in it. And just rewatching the movie on the tabletop and this time it doesn't work out, it's just more disappointing than losing a board game needs to be, in my opinion. And yeah, you can win in different ways, but you're now not following the movie anymore. If you win by bringing your Fellowship, for example, through along the western coast of Middle-earth, and you avoid Moria entirely, and Gandalf's still with you at the end of the game, you might win, but it feels like a bastardization of the story to an extent. So you're in a lose-lose situation with a lot of Lord of the Rings themed board games. This either have to give you agency or give you immersion, or give you some mix of both that's very hard to balance. What the Lord of the Rings the card game does, gives you immersion by putting you into the world of Middle-earth, but it doesn't always send you on the same story. It does have expansions where you take on the Lord of the Rings story, but most of the game is not at all along with the story. So the major expansion cycles of the game took you from Mirkwood throughout Middle-earth, and it went a little bit like this. In the first cycle of the Lord of the Rings the card game, which includes the core set and the Shadows of Mirkwood expansion cycle, you begin in the south of Mirkwood, near Dol Guldur. You move towards the Carrock, where Beorn hangs out in The Hobbit, and then you also move back south a little bit through Mirkwood. While these settings will evoke The Hobbit and the Hunt for Gollum storyline that is going to actually be made into its own movie, it doesn't follow so tightly to the Lord of the Rings books that you feel like you have to succeed, otherwise you have doomed not only this individual game you're playing, but you have doomed the fate of Middle-earth. The second cycle of the game, Khazad-dûm and the Dwarven cycle, you move into Moria. This cycle thematically puts you in Moria, leaving Moria and then facing Durin's Bane, which was unfortunate because around the same time the Saga expansions to the Lord of the Rings were released, where you did actually go in and fight Durrensbane like the Fellowship did in the Fellowship of the Ring. In the matter of like a year or two, you ended up facing Durrensbane in some form 3 times. That was a little bit repetitive. But the third cycle of the game is when things start to get a little bit more interesting. With Heirs of Numenor and the Against the Shadow cycle, you were questing in and around Gondor. And then in the fourth cycle of the game, the Voice of Isengard and the Ringmaker cycle, you're moving in and around Isengard, Rohan, and Dunland. While these areas were featured within the Lord of the Rings, your actions are much more divergent. For example, you're not replaying the Battle of Pelennor Fields or the Battle of Helm's Deep. The fifth cycle of game is when things really started to take off. With the Lost Realm and the Angmar Awakened cycle, you began to explore the realm of Arnor, which has an actual fairly interesting history to it, but has never been on the big screen. In the sixth cycle of the game, you have the Grey Havens and the Dream Chaser cycle. This is where you move west to Lindon and the Grey Havens, and you actually go onto the ocean, which is very different than anything that happens in the books. You eventually land in Harad, with the Sands of Harad and the Haradrim cycle, moving then north to the wilds of Rovanion in the Arid Mithrin cycle, and finishing up with a Shadow in the East and the Vengeance of Mordor cycle, taking place in the Land of Ruin. So the Lord of the Rings card game succeeds in allowing you to play the game without needing to tightly follow the story or feel like you're obligated in any way to follow the story of the Lord of the Rings to be successful. But there's another way that the Lord of the Rings card game is able to fully capitalize on the lore of Middle-earth, and it's in the fact that it's a card game. You see, when you have an expandable card game, you need to have a lot of cards. To have a rich experience, especially in deck construction, you need to have a lot. There aren't going to be enough characters in the main events of the story anyway. So when the game designers started to take the game throughout Middle-earth, certain characters had to be invented. Characters and settings had to be invented that felt true to Middle-earth, but didn't have to be necessarily true to the events of the Lord of the Rings. After all, you are sometimes putting together teams of characters that didn't really live at the same time. I'll tell you what, they succeeded in doing this. Individual characters in the game can have their own interesting backstories, even if they just sound like they're Lord of the Ringsy type names. That doesn't mean that they're just random names picked out of a hat. Some of them might be randomly picked out of a hat. I don't know about that. Berovor comes to mind, but take Brock Ironfist, for example. The blogger Master of Lore in 2015 did a deep dive on Brock Ironfist. The name Iron Fist is one of the families of dwarves, the 7 families of dwarves in Middle-earth. The dwarves we're familiar with, such as Gimli and Thorin, are Longbeards, and that's only one of the families of dwarves. In addition to the Longbeards, you had the Firebeards, the Broadbeams, the Blacklocks, the Stonefoots, the Stiffbeards, and the Iron Fists. I can't think of a better example of a card that helps you immerse yourself into the setting in a way that is not strictly from the established canon, but also doesn't violate it. And to make one more point for how the Lore of the card game incorporates the lore of Middle-earth in such a deft way as to make it
the greatest modern card game.
The actual setting of Middle-earth is great for this type of dancing on the fuzzy edges of established lore. You see, Tolkien created a universe and wrote in a way where he did not specify in excruciating detail everything that happened. Famously, the Silmarillion includes, if I'm not mistaken, no dialogue in the entire book. This is a book that's effectively the Bible from Middle-earth, and it tells many stories, but no one actually talks to each other. So if you want to make stories, not that anyone has the rights to, but if you wanted to make stories from the Silmarillion and expand on it, you could do that. And all the dialogue, there has to be some sort of a dialogue. I'm assuming everyone was on mute for all of the First Age, so adding that level of detail is both permissible and necessary to expanding on the lore. This is in contrast, for example, to Westeros in the Game of Thrones universe, where George R.R. Martin will take a page and a half describing what gets eaten during the course of a particular feast. If you make a game based on a Game of Thrones, you run a much higher risk of accidentally turning over a stone that was specified in page 374 of Book 3, that stone, if moved, would unveil a dragon or something. I don't know. There's not much of a risk of doing that with Lord of the Rings. So it is not only a game that capitalizes and does a good job with expanding the lore, but it's doing so in a universe that is especially ready to be explored in that way. And that wraps up one of the reasons why I think this is
the greatest modern card game.
But it's not the only thing that makes it a great card game. Obviously, the game needs more than just lore. It needs to actually play well. For the next part of this retrospective, we will dive into the basic mechanics of the game and what makes it one of the best cooperative experiences you can have on the tabletop. Until then, remember to subscribe to Jackson Warfield's Game Room, and I'll see you in the next part of this retrospective.